don't we get started? Thank you all on Zoom and in the room. I wanted to say at home, for coming. I'm not sure when I met Amanda Latimore, but I've been aggressively pursuing her ever since. So I'm very excited that she's been able to come out here and talk. She's director of the Center for Addiction Research and Effective Solutions, CARES, at the American Institutes for Research. She's an epidemiologist by training and actually does epidemiological research. So she conducts research and technical assistance using the social determinants of health lens to improve behavioral health and policy program at the behavioral health at the policy program and practice level. She draws on nearly a decades of experience providing guidance to national advocacy groups, as well as community-based programs and city and state public officials across the U.S. She's also an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and in addition is writing a book on social determinants of health and addiction. So she's going to you'll be citing her a bunch in the future, thanks to her important groundbreaking work. So please give her your attention. Thank you.
Just kidding.
I don't think you want my emails going off.
Oh. All right, hello. Excited to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction. All right, so today, the structural and social determinants of addiction. So the Gallup poll has been asking since the 1940s this question: what is the most important problem facing the US? And this graph here shows you a pattern for people that mentioned race as one of their top priorities, their top responses. And it follows a pretty predictable pattern here. Obviously in the 60s, we were at the center of some of the most important civil rights actions taken in our country. And the next peak was in 2020. The data show that people have not been that concerned about race as they were in 2020 since the 1960s. Well, I know I felt it. I don't know if you felt it, but I felt it. And during the peak of this racial justice movement, other researchers were also reflecting on this as well. What are we doing? Are we making an impact? And the Journal of Bioethics you see here, mentioned that even though we had known for decades, the Human Genome Project had shown us decades ago that there was no biological basis for race, we were still doing research wrong. This research community was still using race as if it were a biological construct. More specifically, health equity researchers were using race wrong. So a lot of us in this room, I'm assuming, are in the field of addiction, and we know that race, drugs, crime, othering, the in-group, out-group biases, they're constantly at play. And drugs are so demonized in America, in the American psyche, that the Floyd's history of drug use came into play as if that were some excuse for circumventing due process or judicial process, which was disgusting, but it happened. And so this line graph shows Gallup data again, this time how important the issue of drugs are for the American public. You see that this peak in 1990, in the 1990s, it corresponds to a time when the crack epidemic was at its peak in the media. Because if you looked at the data, you would know that it had been on a decline for several years. So, I showed you first the public opinion on race. This is the public opinion on drugs, and maybe there's something to be learned if we do this and this. Anyone see a pattern? Are there any intuitive data analysts out there? We can draw an inference from this. I'm not saying this is causal. I'm also not saying it's not causal. What I'm suggesting here is that drug policy has consistently had elements of race and class but especially race. And why is that? Is there anything that we can learn from history? So here's what I'm hoping to cover, to think through. I want to think through this link and what to do about it. First, I'll give you a brief history of drug policy. This link between race and drugs and crime was really already fully ingrained in people's minds by the time Nixon declared his formal war on drugs. And so I'll talk a little bit about the history of early drug policy, during which time I like to call the antebellum period, the time before Nixon. Then I'll talk a little bit about contemporary drug policy and the social impacts. And I'll end with some information about, a model framework to think about the socioeconomic approach to addressing the overdose crisis. And we'll wrap up with some thoughts on an anti-racist approach. How many of you know David Musto? No, a few people. So he's a prominent drug policy historian, and he says in his book, The American Disease, this quote here: "Americans have twice accepted and then vehemently rejected drugs." This was in the 1990s. Understanding these dramatic swings provides perspective on our current reaction to drug use. Americans seem to be the least likely of any people to accept the inevitability of historical cycles. Yet if we do not appreciate our history, we may again become captive to the powerful emotions that led to draconian penalties, exaggeration, or silence. This was 30 years ago, but I think it still holds true today. And we have a real opportunity to look back so that we can look forward. So we're going to do a little bit of that. The 1800s was a period of rapid growth of textiles and machine tools, and this really urbanized society and brought in immigrants. And we were going from an agricultural society to an industrial one in a very short amount of time. So we had immigrants leaving their families in hopes for a better life in America. We had people uprooting to settling in new frontiers. And so how we viewed the fabric of society, which was very traditional, centric on the family, was completely upended. And this was worrying people. They saw a shift as a threat to family life, as a threat to American life, and the preservation of traditional, aka white Protestant, values was a big part of the Prohibition movement. Saloons were really a place where folks were convening in the working class, immigrants, and at the state and local level, the movement targeted these saloons. There were 15-gallon minimum purchasing requirements. I don't know, I can't buy 15 gallons of alcohol right now. So why you would do that back in the 1800s, I don't know. So there were minimum purchasing requirements, and they refused to sell to minorities. So it's clear that they were trying to target the impropriety of certain people. And then the Civil War hit and people got distracted. So then we've got, opium and anti-Chinese sentiments. The Transcontinental Railroad was actually a really big deal. It was the first major feat it was a major feat for the US, and it really changed the economic landscape for the US in terms of commerce. It brought in a lot of jobs, but it was, really hard, really dangerous work, and people were, dropping left and right to pursue gold rushes. And so there was this workforce shortage. And tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants were brought in to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So again, we've got this demographic shift out in the West, and it really worried people. All of the building and the rapid commerce, is contributed to the Depression that happened at that time, the 1882 Depression. And people started blaming the Chinese immigrants for the lower wages and the lack of jobs. And so although opium was already a thing in the US, Chinese immigrants were singled out because they preferred smoking opium. And so this particular substance, this form of smoking, was targeted and was the target of marginalization and drug demonization. And immigrants from China at the time were viewed as a threat to jobs and also the chastity of white women. Hamilton Wright, who was a public official with the State Department, said one of the most unfortunate phases of the habit of smoking opium in this country is the large number of women who have become involved and were living as common law wives or cohabitating with Chinese in the Chinatowns of our cities. I mean, you look back at that now and you're like, that's crazy. But that was the sentiment at the time. And Wright used that to his advantage to build support and sympathies for drug laws. And he said that because he needed to get a law passed on drugs. The US at that time didn't have any laws, and they were hitting up against an international conference where they were going to be talking about drug policy, and America had no drug policy to talk about. So how, it was a matter of saving face at this international convening. And so smoking opium was an easy target. And so they used it to develop a drug policy. And I just want to emphasize that the very first policy wasn't about drugs. It was about saving face. And the use of drug-related propaganda and xenophobia to marginalize immigrants and scapegoat broader social and economic problems eventually succeeded in the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And so for 10 years, we were not able to, Chinese laborers were banned from immigrating to the US. Then we've got cocaine and the anti-Black sentiments. The Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery is abolished. And the Southern economy at this time is declining. So for obvious reasons, when you build your economy around the labor of imprisoned people, and you no longer can have that labor, your economy tanks. So Hamilton Wright was in pursuit of establishing, stricter, more substantial drug policies, and he wanted the U.S. to be, a world leader in drug policy, and so they needed something with more teeth than the banned importation of smoking opium. So building off of that Chinese sentiment strategy, Hamilton did the same thing with cocaine. So along with many other prominent medical professionals, you can see here, there's this, Negro cocaine fiend or New Southern Menace, a prominent, so Hamilton Wright said the use of cocaine by the Negroes of the South is one of the most elusive and troublesome questions which confront the enforcement of the law in most of the Southern states. Cocaine is often a direct incentive to the crime of rape by the Negroes of the South and other sections of the country. Another statement, I believe this one was, a congressional statement. Most of the attacks upon white women of the South are the direct result of cocaine-crazed Negro brain. And what followed was fear. The South was fearful that Blacks would rise up against them, and were being told that the cocaine-crazed Negro brain were responsible for many of the rapes of white women. So obviously 100% fabricated, in case you didn't know. And that cocaine would give them superhuman strength, which led to the higher caliber guns and the enactment of the first federal ban on the manufacture or sale of certain drug classes. Again, this drug policy was not really about drugs. So then prohibition pops back up in the progressive era, and lots of great policies here were related to workplace safety, child labor, anti-corruption law. There were several key social reforms, that said, the idea of eroding traditions was as strong as ever. Women were at the helm of the prohibition movement because of the perceived risk of the drink habit to the family and female chastity, again, from the perspective of prohibitionists. And because of this, it's not really a surprise that, you know, women won the right to vote in the same year that prohibition was passed, both in 1920. And part of the way that they did this was through a strategy that aligned with white supremacy, a movement which is ever focused on maintaining white Protestant tradition. So Belle Kearney, who turned out to be the first woman elected to Mississippi State Senate, says this: the industrial education that the Negro is receiving at Tuskegee and other schools is only fitting him for power. And when the Black man becomes necessary to a community by reason of his skill and acquired wealth, and the poor white man, embittered by his poverty and humiliated by his inferiority, finds no place for himself or his children, then will come to the grapple between the races. To avoid this unspeakable culmination, the enfranchisement of women will have to be effected, and an educational and property qualification for the ballot must be made to apply without discrimination to both sexes and to both races. It will spur the poor white man to keep up with the march of progression and enable him to hold his own. The enfranchisement of women should ensure immediate and durable white supremacy honestly attained. The South is slow to grasp the great fact that the enfranchisement of women would settle the race question in politics. That is a powerful quote. So I don't need to tell you that the dumpster fire that came out of alcohol prohibition was that a dumpster fire. But I will say that the lower class and people of color face some of the worst consequences for poisonings, disability, death. And in the final years of prohibition, we see the policy come out, you know, this approach, this movement came out of alignment with commercial, human interest, geopolitical interest, which actually need to be in place for a policy to be enacted, put in place, and be sustained. And so this, you know, the US was in a few years of the Great Depression, unemployment was at 25%, there was a historic drought in 1931, and the deficit was growing, and policymakers were missing that income that they used to get from alcohol sales, which for some states was as high as 75%. What? 75%. Yeah, they were missing the alcohol revenue. So boom, repealed, just like that. It was so important that they made it a constitutional amendment, but it was just flipped just like that. When commercial interests, human interests, geopolitical interests did not align. So it was unceremoniously repealed, not much of a protest. And so alcohol prohibition didn't work because the policy moved away from mainstream society's interests and commercial interests. Tobacco and alcohol have been essentially woven into the fabric of American society since the colonial days. And so we've done a great deal of excusing both of those substances as policy has been, you know, conversations have happened across time. Historians actually have argued that, you know, the public acceded to prohibition because they actually thought that prohibition was for other people. They were going to be fine. This prohibition was for the immigrants and the lower class folks, the saloon goers, and they were going to be fine. But as time, you know, moved on, they realized this is actually not cool at all. And then, you know, the financial elements, all of that came together. And if you look at the substances that have been targeted and demonized most, they're typically those used by the most marginalized members of society, because drug policy isn't really about drugs. One more example, the Great Depression as I mentioned before, brought in a lot of financial deficit. It brought in economic instability for mainstream society. And of course, what happens? The target of the other. And they used drug policy to do it. So Mexican laborers at the time were very commonly used for farming and other, for cheap labor. And when the economy started to turn, we turned on our cheap labor, which is pretty common. And Harry Anslinger, do you guys know Harry Anslinger? He came into the picture around this time, joined the stage at the end of Prohibition. And he was determined to ratchet up, drug policies so that the U.S. could emerge as this international leader in drug control. And a lot of the cannabis propaganda was released within a few months in the same year, right before the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1936. And some people, folks don't agree on this, but there's some rumor that Anslinger Shop funded some of this propaganda. Reefer Madness, Marijuana are two popular ones. Here's the prologue from the movie Marijuana. For centuries, the world has been aware of the narcotic menace. We have complacently watched Asiatic countries attempt to rid themselves of drugs curse, and attributed their failure to lack of education. We consider ourselves enlightened and think that never could we succumb to such fate. But did you know the use of marijuana is steadily increasing among the youth of this country? Did you know that the youthful criminal is our greatest problem today, and that marijuana gives the user false courage and destroys conscience, thereby making crime alluring smart? That is the price we are paying for our lack of interest in the narcotic situation. This story is drawn from an actual case history on file with the police records of one of our large sites. Note, marijuana, hashish of the Orient, is commonly distributed as a dope cigarette. Its most frightening effect is that it fires the user to extreme cruelty and license. So what happened after that was basically a policy avalanche. States were fearful of the scourge of marijuana. If you think that your child is going to go commit murder and then kill themselves, this is an actual case story from the officials. People didn't know much about marijuana. Those that did, saw it come in through the Mexican immigrant labor force and had their own set of reasons for protesting marijuana. But what came after this were extremely severe penalties that gave people 10 years hard labor, life sentence, death sentence for a first offense for selling marijuana. Just let that sink in. Life sentence, death sentence. So federal government follows suit with its own mandatory minimums because a lot of these policies were a state at the time. And they also link heroin and marijuana in the same penalty. Literally you have the same penalty for heroin or marijuana. Not that I'm trying to drug shame or anything, but. So all of this set the stage for what we would pursue a few years later on a global perspective. And we would ultimately impose our very Western Protestant ideals, which accepted alcohol and tobacco and demonized all other drugs, regardless of the cultural value of some of the plants, coca leaf, for example, to other cultures, recreationally and medicinally. And I just wanted to take a moment, drug policy's ties with racism are substantial. But as we head into Black History Month, next month, I did want to take a moment to say that the temperance movement was not just about white supremacy and women riding the temperance wave to get voting rights. There were a lot of Black abolitionists who were prohibitionists. You see them here. They looked at the saloon and drinking as another form of bondage and subjugation of Black people. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of them, and he departed a little bit from the others. He thought alcohol was holding, Black people back, but he focused more on the structural and social determinants of the drink habit. He connected the problematic use to other social ills, to this legacy of slavery. And this perspective on the structural and social determinants is, from my perspective, the key to the solution. So drug policy has consistently been used as a tool to address white panic, economic instability. You've got your human interests, intolerance for drugs outside of mainstream society, focusing on those marginalized populations, what they're using, where they're using it. White panic, fear of lost American ideals, marginalization of the outgroup in pursuit of economic stability. And then you've got your commercial and geopolitical interests. We've got the economics of cheap labor and racial hierarchies. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening today. A lot has happened actually between Reefer Madness, where I left off, and today. And I'm not really going to go into all the things that happened in between, because basically the stage had already been set by the time Nixon declared his war, and then and, president after president just took turns on who was going to be tougher on crime, tougher on drugs, stoked the fears in white voters. And that was, Nixon he declared the war on drugs in 1970. And some historians actually credit him for the Southern strategy. Do you guys know? Right. So for those of you who don't know, the Southern strategy is the use of code words like crime and urban and things that the American public just automatically, because of this long history of racism, automatically, it's ingrained into our language, the association between Blackness, crime, drugs. And so the Southern strategy is essentially using those code words to talk about things in a racist way without actually saying racist things. Because we had that long history of people purposefully using the association, building up that association between opium smoke, labor challenges and Chinese immigrants and smoking opium and, Black, trying to build Southern sympathy for policy through connecting rape and crime with Black people and crack. Why do I keep saying it's cocaine? Crack didn't come in until later. But the stage had already been set. So they invested a substantial amount on police punitive responses, and all the whole time, investments go up, overdoses rose with it, and the American people ate it up. Because remember, drug policy, not really about drugs, until it was, and it was about them. It was about the other people until it wasn't. Enter prescription drug crisis. So anyone wanting to refute the role of race can refer to this quote that I'm sure many of you have seen already, but it sums up really well, from my perspective, the next few decades of drug policy. So John Ehrlichman, Nixon's top aide on domestic affairs, is describing here the war on drugs, and he says, you want to know what this is really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders and raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And so all of this led to a highly disproportionate rate of incarceration for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, who were up to 75% of the people in state and federal prison for drugs, not because they use drugs more than white people, but because they face more of the consequences of drug policy. And people of color face greater consequences, and then are more likely to have fewer resources to recover from either problematic use or unfair targeted police surveillance. And what the pandemic has shown us is that those in society who were most disadvantaged, for those folks, COVID just made things worse. And among older adults, so what this shows you is different points of time between 2018 and 2021, where the different colored bars show you, different points in time. And you'll see by race, pretty much most racial ethnic groups are increasing, but you see Black, between 2018 and 2020, increasing by 73%. Alaskan Native American Indians increased by 60% for males, and we have large increases for females too in this age group. So one of the ways people are trying to target this disparate impact is through removing the tool of oppression, prohibition. And there are concerns about how this will play out for those who are most marginalized. And one could argue that given the structural issues facing people of color, the benefit of drug policy reforms will actually be diminished by other policies that compensate. So even under complete legalization, which seems completely infeasible without some huge international shifts and change in the single convention, which basically dictates all of the countries who signed on to this that you will follow through with your local policy, your domestic policies to abide by this thing that we all agreed to. I mean, some folks don't know that, like, why don't they just legalize at the federal level, Meryl? Because we are held to the single convention. We all made an agreement. And if we violate that at the federal level, that could cause some problems. Anyway, even if we had complete legalization and had this shift, the ebb and flow of public tolerance combined with the structural racism that already exists means that those substances that are used by marginalized groups are going to be at risk, constantly at risk for being targeted by policy changes. As soon as mainstream society needs something, they're worried, fearful, jobs, whatever, they've got drug policy in its right pocket to make changes that they want to address some other social ill. And history tells us that people of color actually have not benefited as much from reforms. So Black people were 79% of crack convictions, but only 26% of the people who got relief from the 2010 reforms on mandatory minimums were Black. And we see, that disparities in arrests have gone down under decriminalization and legalization, 20%, 22%, 22%. And among those communities that did not engage in reform, the disproportionate arrest went up. We also know that there is a lot of variability state to state. So drug arrests for marijuana are going down generally, but in some states, along with that progress, are actually compensatory increases in other drug arrests. You can actually see a good example of that here. Look at Colorado. Look at that increase in other drugs. Why is there so much variability? Well, it's not really about drugs. And we know from how things are unfolding in California that state legalization has to be followed up with local support. And we're seeing from some of the emerging research here that communities that allow cannabis are more likely to be disadvantaged, less educated, lower median income, more poverty, higher unemployment. So among those counties or areas that engaged, who have allowed commercial cannabis, they're more likely to be disadvantaged. We're also seeing among those that are permitting cannabis that there are consumer protections in areas that differ by poverty and other socioeconomic factors. So on-site consumption, for example, at the very top, on-site consumption, you can see those bans are more likely in more advantaged communities. And then the distance requirements between outlets, which we have done a lot of research already on density and its association with health for alcohol. But we're seeing that it's actually a good thing that there is more of this distance requirement put in place in communities that are more disadvantaged. But it's not clear what this means. There's not a clear pattern, and so people are thinking about this and should be. So anti-racist response. What is doing pretty good on time? Okay, is that correct?
No, it's
No,
12:41.
it's 12:41.
Oh, obviously it's not 7. Okay,
20 minutes.
perfect. Well, actually, 20 minutes. So we know that the law is really only part of the issue. Drug policy is only part of the issue. We know it's not about drugs, and drug policy is a scapegoat for bigger social problems, big social ills. So we need to think bigger. We need to get rid of the punitive laws, obviously, but we are still faced with all of the things that can get in the way of equitable benefit from those reforms. And we're left with the same social ills otherwise. We're left with the same social ills that are part of why people have problematic use to begin with. We know that drug laws have created stigma, high rates of arrests that have downstream consequences for housing, employment, food, and all sorts of things that anybody needs for health and wellness. And without those laws, we still have the structures built on racism, residential segregation that exacerbate drug use for people of color, people in poverty, things like residential segregation, the inequitable implementation of drug laws or whatever laws would remain under this new reform, and structural barriers to housing, employment, and food, and a number of things that aren't even listed on here. So among groups that have problematic use, they have fewer resources to avoid the law, to recover from challenges, and that will still exist with the new drug policy. So we have to really need to consider things from a structural perspective, zooming out from this drug policy and that drug policy, this drug, that drug, and think about root causes and reversing the harms that are now baked into society's perspective on drugs. And our drug policies obviously 100% need to be reformed, but we also have to think about the socioeconomic factors at the structural level, like residential segregation, that are going to influence how the policies are implemented within institutions and how people interact with one another. And there are, different interpretations of drug laws and practice guidelines that then facilitate or restrict access to certain resources. These are very important resources. Social determinants of health right here. So restricted access to social and material resources, and this in turn impacts behavioral and biological responses through health behavior pathways, psychosocial pathways, physiological pathways. So how in the world are we going to do all that, put all that together? Well, I think there are some promising practices in which tax revenue from regulated cannabis are attempting to right the wrongs of past drug policy, particularly in states like California and Illinois. I think these investments are amazing and really excited. You know, I'm excited to see how this all unfolds. We've got community level investments, which is a different, we have been focusing so long on this biomedical model, individualistic, individual intervention, that investments like this at a community level, if states are able to take all of these, even if they're investing in individual level programs, the fact that all of this investment is happening in the community at the same time, if they're able to pull that together for some collective impact to make change, could be huge. And so I think this is great. And could be something much bigger than any of us can foresee right now, if the states marshal their resources appropriately. And so what is equitable investment? In order for those dollars to make the most impact, states need to think about how the most marginalized communities can access these dollars for the greatest impact. And that means technical assistance to help them build the capacity to apply for the grants in the first place. For those states that are doing competitive grants, it means seed capital for potential business owners, technical assistance to help with sustainability of those businesses, and public health technical assistance. States should also be thinking about how to use those dollars to disrupt structural inequities, contribute to economic mobility. I know DC is thinking about, you know, how to do this right now, not through tax incentive, tax income, but through other investments. And one thing that bothers me, not bothers me, but it's like a little, like a gnat in my ear, is that this model, the investment in communities, is predicated on community consumption. And if these businesses are more likely to be in Black communities, and these reparation grants are basically, Black communities are funding their own reparations through consumption of habit-forming substances, there's something like, I don't know about that. But I'm gonna think on that for a little bit and see how, you know, there's something doesn't feel right about that. And here's the most anti-racist thing that you could do, all of you can consider to do right now. How do you, and how does your work reinforce or dismantle systems of inequity? Ask yourself, in what ways do you rely on or benefit from the way things are done now, the systems that are in place now, benefits you, but does not benefit the greater good? And since Monday was Martin Luther King Day, we can see the developing dilemma of white America, the haunting ambivalence, the intellectual and moral recognition that slavery is wrong, but the emotional tie to the system so deep and pervasive that it imposes an inflexible unwillingness to root it out. So here are some things to take away with you, thoughts about what can be done at the individual level right now, inspired by Martin Luther King's approach to his work throughout his life. And these are not, I didn't draw this from like a speech or anything. Are you participating with communities and sharing your power as a researcher? Are you exploring race and also thinking deeply about its implications? Are you talking about structural racism when you interpret and disseminate so you can counter racist stereotypes? Because if you're just out there talking about, look at this inequity, it's terrible, you could be reinforcing stereotypes that already exist in people's minds without explaining the structural foundation of it. Some of the best practices for talking about inequities really, emphasize having these shared goals and thinking about fairness and American ideals. America's is, country of fairness and justice, and we have to pursue that goal together. Are you pursuing work that needs to be done? Are you pursuing work that needs to be done instead of focusing on what is available to do? Defined on high by some funding, some agency or organization that benefits already from the way things are. You have an opportunity to push against that. Are you investing in good faith communication? Our society of clickbait and quick this and that, there's so much identity politics at play right now. Are you avoiding that and avoiding the reinforcement of that? Investing in good faith communications, not finger pointing or shaming, but good faith communications. This is inspiration from Martin Luther King. He's about building bridges. He was about bringing your heart to the work. He knew that you couldn't pursue change on these tough topics purely through intellectual strategies. And you couldn't pursue it purely through emotion. But when you combined the two, there was power in that. And we're trained in the academic environment very well on the intellectual part. And I felt at times that my own non-traditional experience that I brought to the table was being scrubbed out of me in pursuit of some idea of rigor. But if you feel surrounded by people who aren't like you, hold on to the knowledge that uniquely positions you to be exactly where you are. Positions you to make change. And you're in this space for a reason. And you can bring that to your work. And we need you to bring that to your work. So don't let the system dim your light. Thank you.
We have 8 minutes for questions. If there's any on Zoom,
Hello. Yes, we do have a couple questions on Zoom, but I'll give it to the room. Does anyone have a question in the room? I'll give you the mic so they can hear you and not you as well.
One, thank you very much for the really excellent talk. I think, even though I've been learning so much about drug policy over the course of this program, and previously I learned a ton of new information from this that was really great at contextualizing what we see now. But I guess my question would be, so given that we're talking about structural issues, and I think this is appropriate given, you quoted Martin Luther King, he obviously had a lot to say about the role of global capitalism and imperialism on racism and racist policy making. And so I'm curious to know what you think about how, global capitalism generally, how does that contribute to the way that we see our modern drug policies playing out and the discrepancies that we see in the consequences of those policies here in America?
Yeah, that is a tough question that I would need probably like an hour to answer. And I'll be honest with you that international policy is not my area of expertise, but I do know that, what I hoped to communicate to you all is that there is a lot at play beyond this drug policy is racist, right? There are economic forces, commercial forces. I mean, we're all in dogged pursuit, some of us, for, you know, legalization, but just hold on, like, what's this going to mean for from a commercial perspective? We have all these examples. We can't just be, why should we be blind to what we've already learned about alcohol and tobacco and all of that? And so I say we need to figure out our stuff here at home. And that's an important first step. And yes, of course, all this, you know, international flow of drugs. I know that there are a lot of people working really hard to protect the country from the influence of negative influx of dangerous drugs, and that all needs to be taken into consideration. But I think we can focus on what we know and go from there.
I'm gonna pose a question that is online from to what extent does the dominant focus on addiction as a brain disease undermine anti-racist responses?
Yeah. So the first thing I think about is cocaine craze, Negro brain. Thinking about, I am not discounting at all the biomedical perspective. I think that it is yes and. There's biology happening and it's interacting with the environment. It all works together. But we have focused so long on the biomedical perspective to the exclusion of the other things that has harmed the way that we approach addiction. And it also leaves us in a really tough spot to talk about racial inequities, since we know that race is not a biological construct, and if it's a brain disease, the logic doesn't, like, then you're in this weird place where how do you explain racial differences? Now you're back to cocaine craze, Negro brain. Like, that's why it's so important. That's exactly why it's so important to go beyond the biomedical perspective.
Anyone in the room have a question?
Thank you so much for your presentation. I realize I learned almost nothing that I needed to from AP US history. I was just curious, thinking in like the broader American sense, if you are seeing successful models, I don't know, Canada, maybe especially in thinking of indigenous communities, and like, you know, I hear fundamentally that there's a cultural perspective that has been erased, especially in indigenous populations, and I was curious if you've come across some things that you wanted to also amplify.
Yeah, and I mean, I tried to touch on this a little bit, and how, you know, our international agreements played out, and, you know, all of those plants and drugs that had great value for indigenous cultures were put on the no-no list. Whereas our recreational and things that were woven into the fabric of the American culture stayed off the list. So making comparisons with other countries, personally, it's hard for me to kind of swallow that, because some of these other countries have universal access to healthcare, and like, that's such a big thing, and don't have this long history of racism and how it's, you know, structures of inequity are everywhere. So I tend not to, you know, draw too much because the parallels aren't there for me, but I know that that there is, you know, in some countries, decriminalization has been worked just fine, and, you know, their drug use increased a little bit, but then it leveled off, and there's, you know, nothing measurably wrong with it. Like, they moved on, things are great. Well, they're good. So, yeah.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. Thank you. It was a fantastic talk.